go ahead and get started. Thank you all so much for coming out for this sort of odd event where we are going to talk about sort of what we've seen and done in the last 10 years. And I've been, the last couple of weeks, been going through, a hard drive of unbelievable amounts of stuff and being surprised by a lot of things. And so I'm just awash in history right now, so I'll do my best not to be excessive here. But this is actually about this time, maybe 30 minutes later, the sort of Gulf Coast Institute light bulb went off 10 years ago on the 24th. And I'll talk about what that was all about as I go. Our mission is simple, improve the quality of life in the Houston region. It's simple to say anyway. So it's one of those great things I can always remember it. The origins were in three places. The Foresight project that the Houston Advanced Research Center did. I know some of you participated in that, but that was an effort to find out, bring together hundreds of people to talk about what Houston's environmental issues were, and that happened in '95 or '96. And then in '98, there was an event to begin to talk about, well, how do we solve these problems? Citizens Environmental Coalition, at that time I was the president of the Citizens Environmental Coalition, and working on air quality mostly. And then there was a Sustainable Development Committee that the City of Houston had, and I'm very sorry that Victoria Heron can't be here today, because she was the planner at the city who managed that committee. It had about 100 people on it. Hard to believe, back in '98, and was part of the city. The city was at one point trying to get rid of it because remember Bob Lee, he hated, there's two things he hated. He hated the word sustainability, and he hated plants. Somebody put a tree in his office once, and he just went ballistic. Get it out. So they were trying to get rid of it, so I said, give it to the Citizens Environmental Coalition. And that group actually transformed into the Gulf Coast Institute, although I didn't know that was coming at the time. So the Foresight project had the work of identifying top priority, looking for options and determining which solutions will work best for the region. And they opened it with a guy named David Crockett, who is indeed like great-grandson of David Crockett, and runs the Chattanooga Institute for Sustainability. And he was going on about how radically differently you have to look at your region to get anything to change, and was saying, global trends, we've got to figure out a way so that we have win-win about everything, and to improve the quality of life was the big thing that I started to hear that day. And he talked about the success of turning Chattanooga from the dirtiest city in America into this, Disneyland of smart growth stuff in just 3 or 4 years, because the whole community got behind the picture for the future. And that's what he impressed on me. My background was communications, so to have somebody say that, put a picture in people's minds, and you could start to move that way, was something I understood pretty well. And the Institute, Chattanooga Institute for Sustainability, sounded so cool that I happened to be sitting next to Ann Hamilton from Houston Endowment, and I said, we need a Houston Institute, just like this. And she said, yeah. And so that was it. In fact, we called it the Houston Institute at first. And this was the mission to help improve the quality of life. And we were starting to get into, what we still didn't know what we were talking about here in terms of, I hadn't even heard of smart growth at these times, of course. And so we were trying to figure out the links. We understood about sustainability being about thinking about the needs of the future and our needs without compromising their needs and so on. Ultimately changed to Gulf Coast Institute, because the Houston thing was viewed as too small, that the region, people in Galveston and so forth, don't like that concept. So we thought it's got to be regional, so we made it Gulf Coast because that was the largest eco piece in our whole region that we really didn't pay much attention to. So real quickly, our philosophy, because I had been involved in sustainability previously for since '92, so I brought all this to it, and we would be talking about whole systems, and we'd be noting that everything is connected and developing, and we'd be looking at the thing from 30,000 feet. We weren't going to get into detail. We were going to just talk about what's the big picture, how do we change that picture, and what were the problems, and these were the problems people were talking about. But you know, and the horrible thing is we're still talking about most of those problems. But those were the things that needed to get solved. And then we were just revolving this idea about knowledge workers. People were saying knowledge workers who can go anywhere seek quality of life, and that includes for people when you do market testing and so forth. These items are important. And this idea of a livable community was what we, I think that was an Al Gore actually who used that term, his Livable Communities program, that was soon to end. And so it had to deal with the economy, the community, and the environment, and that was what sustainability is about, the balance of those three things. You don't just, think about the economy. You have to think about all three. And the areas of focus were these, and I'll kind of get into that a little bit. So we said, well, obviously what to do. So just a little digression here, but this is important because this is how we got into, or at least I got to thinking about how this would work. A woman named Danella Meadows, who was with an MIT systems group who did a book called The Limits to Growth, and then they did Beyond the Limits, and these were huge studies where they actually for the first time used some software called World3 to model the whole world and all of its aspects, and begin to say, well, what if this happens, and what if population does this, and energy, and so forth, and began to see that there was a sort of limit. There was a moment at which you could see this enormous decline. And so I've been hugely influenced by that book much earlier. And then she had this apparently, just sort of epiphany one day in front of a group of people and just started writing on a whiteboard all these things about places to intervene in a system in order of their power, so that changing the mindset or the paradigm out of which the goals arise is the highest, the most incredible thing you can do. And then down to dealing with numbers and taxes and stuff like that, to make very small changes. So I thought, well, we're very small. That was me at the time. So we have to do that, the thing at the top, if we want to have any effect. Which I took to mean also changing the goals, and because I knew a lot about information flow. So we focused pretty much in those three places all this time. So the idea was change the story. You all know what the story was back then, right? It was, I remember going to the Congress of New Urbanism in New York in 2000, I think, and the first slide was a picture of a freeway here with you could barely see downtown for all the air pollution, and the words up there were Global Houston. And the speaker said, the purpose of new urbanism is to prevent global Houston. And so I thought, well, okay, that's not a good, that's our story, and that we, it's one we have to change. And so began to work on it. So this notion of quality of life, which begins with health, safety, and welfare, and that health is probably the one that we need to focus on the most. So that begins with air, food, and water. This is pretty fundamental stuff. These are impacted by the built environment. The built environment is primarily by land use. Land use is mostly impacted by transportation infrastructure. And so transportation policy affects all the issues. So our top strategic goal then was to impact transportation policy. But obviously we did many other things too. And did that in order to impact land use. So our key strategies, which actually we didn't get right away, but we sort of got into this pretty quickly, were three. We visualized the regional ecosystem. We didn't know really what we had out here. We had Charles Tapley and June Blackburn talking about where the ecoregions were. Now Jeff Table's department is actually working on that, but there was no real understanding. People actually would say, well, we don't have an environment in Houston. They meant we didn't have mountains. And so you could just throw it all away because there were no mountains. Well, as we know, we have at least, if not the second, the richest ecosystem in North America. And we're now starting to understand that. Two, focus on the regional transportation plan. Look around to see, well, where is transportation really being thought about? It's here, and it's regional. And the plan comes out every few years, and it's out in the future. So it would have goals and so on. So we could work on that. And then the city of Houston, which I remember a planner from Dickinson at a Bay event once saying, we don't know what to do. We have comprehensive planning, we have zoning, we have a plan for the future. We have this 800-pound gorilla that's mindless in the middle of us, and we can't act because we don't know what they're going to do, and neither do they. So, okay, then general plan, comprehensive plan sounds like something people do somewhere. Let's find out what that's all about. So that became a strategy to try to get the city to do a general plan. And the first thing that we did was this vision for the Houston region, which you have here, which was that foresight group I just talked about. We're asked to write a one-sentence vision for the air quality group. And of course, we wrote 2 pages, which we ultimately refined to 1 page, and published this in '98 in the fall, just a couple months after we started. Working, I mean, I didn't write all this, it was like 6 or 7 people working on it. Anybody here? No. And this was a pretty interesting document that I still, when I look at it, I think, that's not bad. You know, that's an interesting idea. And this, we are driven by the need to improve and balance our economy, community, and environment, 21st century community region for the future without sustainable development definition goes here. And there they are, economy, community, environment, and describe them and talk about what the challenges are. So, next thing we knew, so that was adopted as the vision for the Foresight report. And the next thing I knew, it was in the Olympic bid as the bicentennial vision for Houston's birthday, 2036. So that was pretty cool. And of course, we didn't get the bid, so Houston decided not to do it. All it's sort of sad, but this thing surfaces every now and then, and I'm not sure what to do with it. But that was the first thing we did. And then I got a postcard that says, come to this Smart Growth Conference in Austin. I thought, oh, wait, growth is what we're talking about here. And if it's smart sounds like the right kind, I better go pursue that. So I went to Austin to this conference where I learned this, that the smart growth target was that growth was inevitable, but not necessarily negative if properly managed. And you all may remember lots of environmental organizations back then were fighting growth, period. And now you don't hear that so much. You hear, well, let's just see how smart we can be about it. So that's what smart growth was, and marketing sort of changed because people couldn't understand what sustainable development meant, or sustainability. And it's still a difficult term. So that's, I said, okay, that sounds good. So they were saying at that event that people wanted these things, more green spaces, less time in cars. And noting that at the center of all of this discussion is the car. So we're driving a lot further, spending a lot more time, we're losing, the economic losses are huge, the time with our families is cut by the time we spend in cars, and we're losing farmland and green space because we're spreading out. And this, what are we thinking? A family-oriented society is not smart to design systems that can't be sustained. So sustainability is part of smart growth. Economy, community, environment, that same thing. And sprawl is a tricky term. It doesn't mean suburban necessarily. It means disconnected development. That is to say, here's a bunch of houses, no stores, no schools. Here's a school over here. Here's apartments over, and it's all connected by roads and not connected to each other, usually by some freeway. We have lots of examples of that. And at the time, they were saying the poster cities of sprawl were Atlanta, Houston, Dallas, Phoenix. I'm going to forget this later, so I'll say it now. 2-3 years after that, we were alone in that group. Every other one of these cities had adopted smart growth programs and strategies. And when you went to a conference, it was always Houston. So, and I think we're just now getting over that. So smart growth, we started publishing stuff like crazy. Put out a newsletter that talked about that conference I'd just been to, and then called some people to come together. And we had this meeting, which we called the Houston Gulf Coast Smart Growth Initiative, which actually morphed over time into this group. By November of that year, we were meeting regularly here at lunch and calling it the Livable Houston Initiative. I'm not going to read all this to you, but the point is that we began before I even really, had any kind of credentials at all to be writing letters to the tech. What did TNRCC, Texas Natural Resources Conservation Commission, yes, right. Which was working on the state implementation plan for air quality. And we were saying, we need to talk about other things than some of the sort of end-of-the-pipe solutions we're using. We need to talk about clustering of jobs in schools. So the point was to make things more convenient for people, to make things so that people weren't required to drive, and to think about how to bring amenities closer to neighborhoods and so on. And that's the first, for us anyway, the first statement of this concept, which now we talk about as livable communities, livable centers, all those. And this, I'll never forget proposing this. So the strategy, I was on a blue ribbon air panel the mayor put together, and they were talking about all this scientific stuff I didn't know anything about. I said, well, I think it's about reducing combustion, isn't it? I mean, if you just reduce the combustion before you start all the other stuff, and all these guys from Exxon looked at me like, I was what? This is Houston. We don't want to reduce combustion. We want to increase combustion. So I was sort of off the side. But it occurred to me that was the way to go about it. And today, I think, you know, if we, I don't know if I'm stepping on something to say this, but there's two words that are coming out of this building that I think are the whole story, and they are use less. That's at the top of everything we do. Use less. Reduce the need for whatever it is we're worried about. And then for vehicles, it was that same thing. Situate workplaces closer to people, resulting in all these other things. And then establish ways of moving multiple people in single vehicles. That's called transit, isn't it? So, clusters and so on. So the Foresight Report adopted as one of its major strategies for ozone reduction, this notion of changes in the development of transportation systems. And you know, at that time I wouldn't say we were because I was probably the only professional editor. I was always writing all this stuff for everybody, but other people already were way ahead of teaching me this stuff. Had a symposium May 18th about this, and then we had a conference with Alan Clark from HGAC here, talking about Smart Growth Conference. It was, I think, was sort of a moment in Houston history when things actually started, the conversation began to be a little different. This understanding the Houston region was a proposal made to EPA, which I've just read recently and thought it was incredible. We had about 10 partners, and the idea was to do this atlas, this visualization of the whole system. They turned it down, but I think I'll sort of go back to that. Or maybe, like I say, Jeff's on that page now, but it's still kind of a problem. When we were writing like crazy, and I was so thrilled that I wrote this, my first op-ed piece, and the Chronicle called it Big Ideas, and put it all over the front of the thing like that, and that was pretty exciting. But we were starting to make a mark. And then we began to think, you know, if this vision thing is what people need, that we need to have a picture, and it needs to be something that everybody agrees on. Well, what have we actually done already to arrive at that vision? So that pile of stuff there and a lot more, I went through it all and wrote this report called Connecting the Visions that talked about 50, I think, different visioning processes, a couple of regional ones, small neighborhood sort of stuff. So you can actually begin to see that there are things people do agree on. There's a kind of vision out there. And every time we do a Blueprint Houston or Envision Houston region, it's the same thing. It's always there. It's Steve Kleinberg's surveys. It's always the same. So we had a conference about that. You recognize some of these heavy folks. And I'm trying to go past this. So in terms of visualizing the regional ecosystem, well, for us that meant we had to figure out how to physically do that. And so I heard about this stuff called geographic information systems. So we decided that had to be our first employee. And I found this guy, Peter Price, who was a retired Marathon Oil GIS guy, who I couldn't have found anybody who knew more about this. He just wanted he worked for a very low salary for a couple of years, and he got us totally on the map, so to speak, in terms of doing GIS here. And we were doing work for a lot of organizations. City Green, we did lots of work with trees, and so I won't go into that. The City of Houston General Plan, the city is required to do a general plan. It's in the code. It's a duty to adopt a comprehensive plan as it does so. So we created this 1,000 Friends of Houston idea, which was first to be a place for individuals to put money to support what we were doing, and then it would be the entity that would call for a comprehensive plan. And this was an ad we put in what used to be a local newspaper called the Upper Kirby Progressive. So that's Houston's future plan looks like that. And so we said we the people need a plan, and Mayor Brown actually bought it. It was part of the election discussion that year, 2001, started a website for it, and made this proposal to Mayor Brown, which he accepted. He said, yes, it's time, we need to do this. So the odd thing is, right at the end of Mayor Brown's term, the city was on a course to do a comprehensive plan for the future. Then he was out of office. So Blueprint Houston was created to sort of get into the nuts and bolts of that, starting with this gigantic Congress that we had on May 31st that produced a vision for the city of Houston. Talk just a minute about Midtown. I spent a lot of time working with Dan and others in Midtown back then, trying to, because it seemed to me that was it. That was the bedroom community for downtown. If you wanted to see where really interesting urban developments, similar to, say, Chelsea or Greenwich Village, that kind of thing in New York, could happen, it was going to be Midtown, because we had a light rail line there, and it was like everything was available. You know, it was basically some old buildings, a lot of vacant lots, and I was at that time calling it Next Urban Place. And that was when we sort of did our first scale thing. This was just to show that red line is Manhattan. Midtown is this little space right here, downtown above it. And then the line out here is the loop. So Manhattan fits inside the loop 4 times. And it has 2 million people who live in it. And 500,000 people live in the loop. So we're talking about a scale here that's totally unlike anything we can even dream about in Houston. If we were at the same scale as Manhattan, that would mean we'd have 8 million people living inside the loop. And then the other one was, as I recall, and Dan would maybe correct me on this, but the talk was that talk of Midtown as a neighborhood. And I thought it was awful big for a neighborhood, so I went and got the red line, I think I have that's the outline of, oh gosh, I've got them on a scale here, both slides. Do I get another one? Yeah, okay. Brought lower Manhattan in at the same scale. Well, all of a sudden you see there's 7 or 8 neighborhoods in Manhattan. It's got 5 or 6 parks in it. You know, there was a talk at that time for a park in Midtown. So you begin to see how, the difference, how we might be thinking about this. And as you wander around Midtown, of course, it is very different kinds of places all over it. And I think that we were the first to put these little circles on the light rail line and say, this quarter-mile walking thing that I'm beginning to hear about is so perfectly played out in Midtown, it's just hard to believe. So that's where the rail line is, and I think this was a proposed rail line, which now goes somewhere a little different. But the point was that you were talking about a space that had 3 distinct, almost 4 distinct neighborhoods just based on the transit stations. So how can we think about that? So that was fun to do. And then of course the silliest thing, although I don't believe it was silly at all, there's this giant super block. It's 4 blocks long. It's right at the McGowan station. It's right now almost entirely empty, and nobody quite knows what to do with it. It's half owned by the Midtown Management District, or redevelopment, and the other half by Camden Properties, yeah. And I was up in the Comal River, up in New Braunfels, and floating, thinking how beautiful this thing was, and thought, how big is this? How big is this area I'm looking at? So when I got back, I went to our little Google thing and took it out. That's the place I was in, and it fits right in the super block. So that's the Comal River in New Braunfels. And so I said, why don't we do that? Why don't we do a park like that? Well, not quite, but Kevin Shanley at SWA Group came up with this idea, which, would be so cool to have. We put a lot of energy into trying to convince people to go here. Had a postcard writing campaign to the mayor, but he just wasn't interested. So, but the block still sits there. I don't know, maybe you'll talk about it. So the regional transportation plan, we were driving the most. When I first got into this, I thought, oh God, that's horrible. It doesn't surprise me, but we drive more than anybody else. So the 2025 plan, which would have been, what? That would have been 2003 or so, something like that. Started looking at this thing, it's quite a document. It's got lots of documents attached to it. And saw things like, we're going to do 11,000 lane miles of new roads, 60% expansion. And most of the money was being spent for roads. But if you look at other places, like Dallas and Atlanta, you see that it's quite different. I mean, Dallas, for instance, Dallas is the blue, or Atlanta is probably the best example. They spend more on transit than they do on roads, so that was their plan for the future. So as I began to kind of look around, I realized that no one else in the United States had the strategy for the future that Houston had, which was more roads as far as you can get them out, and lots of them. So we started this newsletter, started doing these reports. That Catherine Pernod, some of you remember, was just a whiz-bang. She was one of those bright young people who was a senior financial analyst at Enron, and then she was unemployed. And so she didn't want to ever go back in the corporate world. Came and worked with us for a while and did some great work. Put out these bulletins about the plan that I think helped people understand what was going on. I think maybe for the first time people didn't know this plan existed. Generally speaking, you could talk to council members city council members who didn't know there was such a thing. And then the Metro referendum came along, and we started a series of bulletins that came out every other day up in the last 2 or 3 weeks up into the thing. And as you know, it was a squeaker, but this was the only source of real information you could get, because the bad guys were out there, spending tremendous amounts of money on television and telling stories that were just flat not true. So we were countering all that and giving people tools to go for the, it was like 51 to 49 or something. It was pretty close. And one of the things we did with the regional transportation plan, among all those 11,000 miles, it was all like, most of those streets were not way out, they were in your neighborhoods. So we did these maps for each council district. Well, boy, did people start showing up at council to complain about this stuff. And so all of a sudden, a lot of people were focused on the regional transportation plan for the first time. One of the things, all the data has always been really interesting to me. And as I began to look at these maps that would come out, like the regional growth track, it was always this donut sort of thing. It's in here, and then it grows out here, and then it grows out here. And it didn't feel like that to me as I just sort of went around. And then we'd see this kind of stuff where most of the giant stuff was happening out at the edges, or a map like that where you'd say the darkest places would have the most number of people. Let's say that's 5,000 people. And so you'd say, well, all the growth's out there, nothing's happening in the middle, except that then you realize, you can't see it at this scale, but in here, there would be little teeny dark red places that had 5,000 people in them. And another one out here that was like 10,000 acres that had 5,000 people. And it's really interesting. I don't know that we've ever had this discussion, Jeff, but the more I thought about that, the more I thought, this is only data. This is not information. This is not even information. You really can't quite get anything out of that. So we were asking, can we make these things all the same size? And this is not unusual. Everybody did this. These are called RASs and TASs, regional analysis zones, transportation analysis zones. And then these kinds of things where we would see about growth. Obviously, if you look at this, Fort Bend and Montgomery, for jobs, everything, we're expected to grow the most. Except that those are percentages. So I remember James Calloway telling me, if you ever hear about a company talking about itself being fast-growing, avoid it, because that means it's really small, and they're just getting started. So if you look at that a different way, if you talk about the absolute number of people that will be added to each of those counties, well, pretty clearly Harris County, in this case, was going to add twice as many people as all the other counties combined. But all the energy is about the other counties because those are fast growing, whatever that means. Or another way to look at it, no matter what, it's Harris County. And you might have seen recently there was a Chronicle story that said Fort Bend County is the fastest growing county for jobs, I think, for jobs in America. The same story said that Harris County will add more jobs than any other county in America. But that didn't make the headline or the lead. That's the way it went. You know? And it was stupefying. It was 10 times as many jobs as Fort Bend. More than that. So we started complaining, as Jeff knows, about these percent change things. And another one that was really big, you constantly had this story and charts showing that lane miles, I mean, the population growth was growing faster than new lane miles of roads. And this was what are we going to do, you know? You still see that when Texas, whenever the governor's commissions do things, you still see that. But that's all over America. If you say, take out the rural roads, and if you just talk about the urban populations and the urban lane miles, in Houston, it looks like that. Way more building of roads than growth of population. So then, along I'm jumping a couple of years, we get into the 2005 forecast where we see, wow, a grid where every geographic unit is the same size as every other. Now you can actually see something. This is just the growth. And this was an early chart. So this is not where anything is, this is percentages or whatever, rate of growth. Well, that was pretty exciting because we were going from that to that, same information, but it's a totally different picture. Here, all the people are out here. Here, they're all in here. But it's the same people and it's the same data. And so we started doing, taking their data. And by the way, this is great stuff, and HJC is fabulous for giving you whatever they've got, you can get it, and use it, and massage it, see what you can make out of it. And so we started saying, well, what if you make green, actually mean very low population, rural or wild places and so on. As you get denser and denser, you can say there's the reds are the urban areas and the yellows are the suburban areas and the light green is the rural areas and the dark green is the wild areas. And just started making up some numbers, and then we thought a citizen can look at that and say, well, I see what's happening. Take very little explanation to explain what's going on here. So when you see that, the 2005 population, 2035 population, story's clear. You're losing a lot of green space, among other things. Now, I'm happy to say that HJC's maps look just like ours. So I don't know what comes next. And the vision for the RTP in 2025 was enhance mobility by providing efficient, portable, safe, environmentally responsible transportation sources for people with it. The 2035, 10 years later, says our community will have a better quality of life through improved mobility, better access. It's a huge word, I won't talk about it now, but it's a huge word as opposed to mobility. And a healthier environment. So this is massive progress, I think. So the only regional vision that we have is this one that I know of, and it's designed to improve the quality of life. So a huge change. Where before it was designed to improve the amount of driving people do, or the ease with which they do. The goals, this is a big thing too, but the goals are from which everything flows. So reduce congestion has always been a top goal. Well, nobody's ever reduced congestion in any corridor in the United States with any strategy except congestion pricing. That only does it for the people in that way. Now we're talking about in 2035, improve mobility, less congestion, of course, but build stronger communities. That's a transportation goal that our region has. Increase transit, preserve floodplains. This came from citizens participating, saying what they wanted. So the biggest thing that HGAC did, I think, was decide to go ask citizens and have these huge events. And now we have a different vision and a different set of goals that are actually very similar to some of the most progressive places in the country. So the region is now pursuing a different story, and that story is about Houston green. And so for 2 years, we've been doing this green, green city stuff. Some of you have seen that, talking about the garden cities. I think I'm at the end. So this was our annual report last year on progress, in which we said green takes center stage. I think it's true. I think this city, region, I hope you'll address this, is so focused on green. Now, I'm not sure we all know what it means, but I mean, we are there, full tilt. New vision for access and mobility and livable centers. Livable centers, so maybe Jeff can talk about that. So, HJC is doing some work that I think is groundbreaking, and I talk about this livable centers and some of the things they're doing, the sustainable mobility map and so forth in other places, and people aren't doing that somewhere else, to my knowledge. So we may be doing groundbreaking work here in Houston, and now we've got to get the projects to actually have something to do with the strategies and the vision, but maybe that will. And so blah, blah, this is how we talk about what we do. And in all that time, this is actually fun to keep this up every year, but we've produced a tremendous amount of stuff, and has it been useful? I hope so. So that's kind of our story. I'm going to ask Dan Barnum, who is an architect and who is with the Midtown Management District and was one of the people in Midtown. He and one other guy started the whole revival, as I get it, of Midtown, and then Jeff Table, who runs the community environmental planning, to sort of talk about what they think has happened in 10 years and so on. And just before I stop, remind you that tonight we're going to have a birthday party. No charge. There's more of these up here. It's at the Rice Hotel. Just come on. You'll have to pay for your own drinks. So I hope it'll be fun. I know all of you will come. So thank you. Yeah, why don't we all just sit?
Teaching 1 o'clock class.
Okay. Yeah. We'll see you tonight.
I'm Dan Barnum, architect with HBL Architects. The part of Houston that I know best is Houston inside the loop. The 50 years that I've lived in Houston, 40 of them have been inside the loop. My office has always been inside the loop. Now I live in Midtown and have been very active in the redevelopment of the Midtown area for 20 years. So mostly that's what I know about. That's the statistics that I have on the top of my head and that sort of thing. And I think it's a good example of what we have in Houston and what we have on the inner city. And it's sort of typical of much of the inner city of Houston. So just a few things about that. I came to Houston in the mid-50s as a student at Rice. And Houston at that time didn't have any freeways. Well, no, it did have the Gulf Freeway. The Gulf Freeway had just been completed. Well, I say that in some jest because it's still under construction, as we all know, and has been ever since 1953. But between 1955 and 1975, a period of 20 years, the whole of the inner city of Houston changed dramatically, largely due to the development of the freeway system and the resulting flight to the suburbs. As a prime example of that, I'm a member of Trinity Episcopal Church, which sits right in the middle of Midtown at Main and Holden. In 1955, Trinity was the 6th largest Episcopal church in the country, with well over 2,000 members. In 1975, it had about 150 active members. So in 20 years, it almost disappeared. And that was typical of churches throughout the area, typical of communities. Schools that had been community centers disappeared, closed down, became empty, and were eventually torn down. All the different wards, a lot of that was happening. Even the ones with minority populations the third ward, for instance, a lot of that population was becoming more affluent, and rather than staying in their communities and rebuilding, they were also fleeing to the suburbs. So these areas were just being hollowed out. That was somewhat exacerbated by an EPA ruling, and I don't remember when it came down, but basically it said, Houston, your sewer treatment plants are not adequate for the city, and you may not grow anymore. You may not add any capacity until you increase your sewer capacity and your sewer treatment. We were pumping raw sewage into Buffalo Bayou. And so there was a building moratorium. Well, at the same time, there was the energy boom, and downtown was exploding. So how do you do that? Well, what you do is you attach to each piece of property a sewer right for so many connections or so many gallons per day or something. I don't even know what it was. But all of a sudden, properties in areas like Midtown became more valuable for their sewer rights than for their property, than for the house that sat on them. And so the sewer rights were sold to downtown developers so that they could build the Exxon building and the other high-rise buildings that were being built at the time. And those houses were no longer habitable. So we had block after block after block of houses in Houston, in inner city Houston, not just in Midtown, but the area I'm familiar with is Midtown, that couldn't be lived in. And so, but the city and the county were still taxing them as if they were livable. So they got torn down. And if at that time, if you drove through the 3rd Ward or the 5th Ward or the 6th Ward, you found lots of empty land because of the same thing. The sewer rights had been sold and houses were torn down. And we had a huge loss of wonderful old early 20th century housing stock that just disappeared in a very, very short period of time because that property was more valuable for the sewer rights that had been sold than for the livability of it. So in the mid-1980s, I came to Midtown, so to speak. We knew that the sewer treatment plants were under construction, that at some point soon the sewer rights were going to be, the moratorium was going to be lifted and something could happen. And Steve Bancroft, the rector at Trinity Episcopal, and I started the Midtown redevelopment. In 1995, January 1st, so in December of 94, it was approved by the city to be implemented in 1995. At that time, the area of Midtown, which was on the slide up here that David showed, had 500 residents and about $100 million in tax base. Now, 13 years later, there are 18,000 residents in Midtown, and it has about $1 billion in tax base. That $1 billion is twice what we had projected for the first 25 years of the tax increment reinvestment zone, and everybody thought we were crazy when we projected that back in 1994 that it would grow. Now, Kent is sitting over here, and his organization had done a study in the early 90s about residential demand in downtown and Midtown, which we relied on heavily because it showed that there was a demand in the downtown Midtown areas for over 100,000 housing units. There were 3,000 or 4,000 at the time, at the most. We said if only 25% of that number is correct, we've still got a housing boom potential for the next 20 years in the Midtown area and the downtown area. And sure enough, that's happened. And yet it's just started. We've just begun. If you go into the Midtown now, you'll see that the Main Street corridor still hasn't been developed. Now, part of the reason for that is the land speculators got in ahead of the developers, and they bid up the cost of the land and increasingly made projects so that they were not financially feasible. which I never understood until somebody sat down, and I can't explain it to you, but I think I kind of understand. The problem with densifying the inner city is that we can sprawl endlessly into the Katy Prairie or the Piney Woods in Montgomery County or out into Chambers County or down toward Galveston and on cheap land and therefore build cheap houses. And as long as you can build and buy a house way out there that's inexpensive, then people aren't going to come in and buy a more expensive inner city condominium. You've got to be able to restrict what's available out in the suburbs before the inner city can densify. I don't know if that explains it, but that's basically how I understand it. Just a little bit about what's positive and negative about Midtown. The positives, we have post-Midtown development, which I think of as the poster city for inner city redevelopment. We have some really nice townhome communities. I happen to live in one. We have some nice parks. We do have the super block, which is sitting there waiting. I still have a dream of building Kevin Shanley's park and the underground parking garage that goes with it on that property at some point. Whether that can happen, I don't know, but we've got Discovery Green and nobody thought that was possible, and it sits there and it's thriving today, and it has changed the dynamic of that side of downtown. We've got the same potential in Midtown to change the whole dynamic in that area. We figured out that we could build a park with a 4-level parking garage underneath it that would provide all of the parking needed for all of the blocks around that with a very high density of development. And the increase in property value for the surrounding property would more than offset the loss of property value from turning a taxable property into a non-taxable property. There are a lot of good projects in the works. Whether or not they can happen in today's financial climate is quite another story. The negatives, we have developments like CVS, which are suburban shops in the middle of urban areas. We have strip centers that pop up because Houston developers don't know what else to do other than build standalone retail and strip centers. We have tremendous parking problems. There are solutions available, but nobody wants to really bite the bullet and do them. And we have a lack of vision among the board members, particularly of the redevelopment authority. And I tell them that, and so I don't mind saying it here. And we have a great potential for affordable housing in the area and lots of money within the coffers of the TERS to spend on affordable housing, and nobody has figured out yet how to do it. In the future, we've got a major center coming in where the University line crosses the Main Street line at the Wheeler Station, which is next door to Sears on Main Street. That has the potential to become a new town center. There will be something like 100 to 150,000 transit passengers passing through that point every day, some 10 to 15 years from now. We've got the potential to build transit-oriented development at at all of the transit stops on the light rail lines. Almost all of that's inside the loop. And then one final thing. A couple of years ago, in the summer of 2006, Gulf Coast Institute and the Texas Sea Growth, Sea Grant, and the Midtown Management District jointly sponsored the Ensemble HCC Tomorrow workshop, at which we looked at the potential for transit-oriented development at the Ensemble HCC rail stop. And we produced a report that showed lots of potential and lots of problems, and it pointed out very clearly the impediments to transit-oriented development in the Houston area. That report was fairly widely disseminated And it got a lot of attention, and it led to the two-phase Urban Corridors Initiative that has just recently been concluded, which is in fact leading to new regulations now being written for inner city redevelopment in Houston. And if we can get those new regulations codified, then we have a major step taken in the way of potential redevelopment in Houston, in the inner city part of Houston. And it will forever, I think, change the way we do development in Houston, and we can get to the kind of density that we need for the kind of quality of life and the sustainability that we all look forward to. And that's about all I have to say. Jeff, it's up to you.
David, I know you're pretty strict about the time here, and I'm seeing 5 minutes left. So,
Let me start at 1:30.
1:30, okay.
Yes.
All right. Well, I'm seeing 35 minutes left. Actually, the birthday of the Gulf Coast Institute shares a birthday of sorts with my organization, the Houston Galveston Area Council, almost to the date. The adoption of a document we called Goals for Tomorrow. And I apologize, this may actually be the last paper copy that I have in my possession, so we can try to get this out there. It is still available on our website, however, h-gac.com. I don't have the specific link, but go into Community and Environmental Planning and you'll find it under Publications. This was really the first broad goals document HGAC had produced since the late 60s. And it was not, unlike some of the projects David talked about, really a citizen developed vision. We worked with the board of directors here, which are elected officials throughout the 13 counties you see on that map, and all of the advisory committees that they appoint to come up with an omnibus set of goals that would both roll up some of the existing plans that we had, like transportation, water quality, also come up with some new goals, particularly in the areas of regional growth and quality of life. And a lot of these goals we came up with in Goals for Tomorrow had never before been articulated by HGAC, let alone many of the member governments. And just looking back through it this morning, I noticed calls for more public spaces, more human-scale development, greater emphasis on parks, call for town centers, a call for pedestrian bicycle accessibility being designed into roadways and other commercial districts, call for conserving important environmental assets. Hard to believe, but prior to 1998, at least at this organization and many other local governments, there were not adopted goal statements of that kind that we saw many of. Obviously, we built on the efforts of the Institute and the Foresight Report and looking at what some of our peers around the country were doing. I think it's instructive to, 10 years later, kind of take a look at how we did on that. I think a lot of people felt, yeah, those are pretty words, it's rather pie in the sky sort of effort. Even some of the staff may have felt that way. But I think we are moving actually along a pretty good pace at 10 years out on a lot of these things. And I oversimplified the rule of three, but I'll give you 3 key things that I think have changed in the last decade that have helped us on that. And this is from the HGAC perspective, not the global or societal perspective. Now, David covered a lot of this first off, but the capabilities we have to understand growth dynamics, I'm talking about the technical capabilities we have here, are just a quantum leap ahead of what we had in 1998. We thought we were pretty good in 98. Also on our website, you can look at our growth forecast and see specifically the new tiled grid system we have for developing growth. And I am actually very proud that David thought we were worth complaining to about how we presented our maps and even on things like color scheme and scale and whatnot. I think that's a healthy public agency that's transparent, takes public input, and can admit when we need some improvement in those areas. I think the ability to model at that scale the kind of base data and kind of electronic data we now have from the appraisal districts, that we can really see very immediately changes in land use patterns, changes in building types. That all goes back into our model and helps us predict things more effectively. I would say, David, that so far you are the only one who's really taken us up on this, but we've had another paradigm shift, pardon the cliche again, at HGC. I think we used to be a lot more proprietary about some of our data. I think we had some visions that maybe this was going to be a revenue source for us. I think now we understand much greater power in getting this information into people's hands, collaborating with other groups who can think of creative ways to slice it and present it. And I would encourage any of those of you with capabilities, you can download almost all of this stuff if you know what to do with it. And we'd be interested in seeing what we came up with. I was at a panel at the Rice Design Alliance earlier this summer. We talked a little bit about this, how we can have more citizen experts out there and how that improves the performance of experts. So I think the data and our ability to understand what's going on is a big first step. The other thing I'll just add parenthetically is I am interested in our getting out of the crystal ball business. What is the forecast? I don't know. It's 35 years out. You know, well, our models do a good job of predicting the future if the future is just like the past. Somebody asked me what some situation is going to be like in the future the other day, and I said it's going to be just like the past, only different. Well, let's talk about those differences. I'm excited about us maybe being able to more effectively see what hypothetical gas prices, demographic shifts, hypothetical public policies would do to some of these grid maps. So I think that's the challenge where we're going now. The stuff we're doing today, I think in 2018 will look like berry juice on the cave walls. It's moving that fast, our capabilities. Very excited to be in this business. Second one, David also alluded to. We used to do public outreach on transportation plans. Carrie remembers some of these meetings. We get very few citizens in a lot of places. Some would show up in big numbers, usually exercised about a specific facility. But when we started the Envision Houston Region process and talking to people about mobility in the context of land use and quality of life and environment and community, I think that produced a much richer dialogue, and I think was pretty successful in mobilizing people and getting their views. And it has permeated everything we do here, so much so that it's spilled over into some of our member governments and their planning. My staff, along with our transportation group, has now helped facilitate 3 different visioning strategies for different communities. Austin County, which has a very different vision than a lot of our fast-growing suburban counties. We work with them. We work with the city of Montgomery, city of Pearland, doing these same sorts of exercises where people get this pile of chips or poker chips or stickers to connote growth, and then talk about how they'd like to see that growth manifested. So it's not anti-growth, it's smarter growth. I think both in terms of my department and our transportation group, we really look at the bicyclist special districts project back in 2004, where using demographic and land use factors, we really, for the 8-county area, identified specific zones in which we projected latent pedestrian bicyclist facility demand. And this study has really shaped an ongoing planning process. We've now done 6 specific special district studies. This one's in Gulfman, where we did kind of a miniature regional transportation plan for sidewalk and bikeway improvements in those neighborhoods. And HGAC has set aside money in our capital program to build projects in those areas. We're still waiting on the first one of those projects to be built. More on that in a minute. The other thing that we're very proud of is, oh, by the way, we used to have the pedestrian bicyclist program was a work plan item of a staff person who had many other things. We now have a full-time pedestrian bicyclist coordinator position. We also have a full-time land use transportation coordinator position, and she's sitting right there, Meredith Dang, who has just been outstanding in developing our Livable Centers program, for which we have our just off the presses new brochure. I'm not going to pass them out to everybody if you're not really interested, because we went through the last iteration so fast, but I'll leave this stack here, and if you'd like to take a look at it. This is kind of getting at that whole holistic nexus, I think, that David is talking about of, you know, how do we put stuff close together so people can walk between destinations, and how we get a critical mass that we can serve the transit. It's easy to talk about investing in transit. Transit doesn't really work that well in linear patterns. You know, we've got a 20-mile road, and every half mile we've got another 20 jobs spread out. It's going to be very hard to design a transit system that serves that. We say we need to spend more on transit. Well, I don't know what that does. You put 50,000 people within walking distance of a transit stop, whose jobs, 50,000 jobs, you can run 5-minute transit service cost effectively with that. So this whole idea of reimagining the region as connected centers, I think, has been a huge new step. I'll close. David asked me to talk a little bit about how the dialogue was different today than it was in '98. And I'll again go with 3 things. 2 positive, 1 not so. I used to be the president of the Texas chapter of American Planning Association, and after that served on several national boards for APA. And I was very interested, typical Houston city planners, inferiority complex, meeting people from Portland and Seattle and Boulder and all that. And the conclusion I came away with from those conversations, and I don't mean this to sound egotistical, the planners in those places, architects, designers, are no smarter than people here. By no means is that the case. The extent to which I met elected officials from those areas, I didn't sense a big upgrade in vision or intellect over. We got a lot of smart people. We work for elected officials all over the region, and those are smart, committed people. So I'm going to put it back on you all. The biggest difference I saw and heard about from planners in those places was the level of citizen engagement. They have great planning in Seattle because the residents demand it. You can't get elected if you're not responsive to those needs. And people have very specifically voiced that we want parks and we want walkable neighborhoods and we want historic preservation, and you're not going to get elected if we don't get them. And that was the difference I saw. Since 1998, I think we have a much more engaged and sophisticated citizenry. In addition to the Gulf Coast Institute that I just can't say enough about, how they've helped advance that dialogue. Blueprint Houston, Citizens Transportation Coalition, many environmental groups all single out Houston wilderness, groups that are not only changing the story, as David said, but telling people where's the meeting, where's the hearing to show up, who do you write to about the RTP, that sort of thing. And believe me, there's advocacy groups, for developers and engineers and other that sure let people know where the meeting is and who to write to on that. I think this just advances the dialogue. I'm not saying it levels the playing field, but people are busy. They need organizations like these to help digest issues, point them in the direction where they can give the elected officials that kind of input. Nothing wrong with that. Advocacy strengthens everybody. Second real epiphany I've had is the people closest to us in this whole process. This is going to sound like a shocker. Are the developers. The developer is actually right about here. If you look at, smart growth advocates and the developers, you cannot go to a ULI meeting these days and hear a presentation on suburban strip centers, Urban Land Institute's developers organization. It's totally focused on mixed-use, smart growth town centers. One of our transportation staff and I met with a developer actually the day before Ike, talking about a project where they're going to have a major residential project with not one but 2 town centers integrated into the project, one of which their stated goal is to make that, to supplant the Woodlands as the place where tour groups go in Houston to see how to do a town center right. Cinco Ranch, Sugarland, Pearland has 2 of them. Developers get it, for all due respect to them, there are still people doing strip centers, but there are lots of people who are sophisticated, who get it, who see the market moving this way. I think the architects, same deal. Look at what AIA's done with their Urban Design Committee and the RUDAT, the Green Building Council. The private sector is there. The private sector is not our enemy by any means. They're a partner. That I don't know was as true 10 years ago. Final thing, not as encouraging perhaps, but I'm giving you a solution. If you go to our board meeting, if you go to our Transportation Policy Council meeting, you go to the Texas Department of Transportation, Texas Transportation Commission meetings, the top elected decision makers, top agency heads, you will find, even with all the progress we've cited, you'll find very little conversation about the things we talk about in Smart Growth Initiative meetings. And a lot of times those individuals will say, well, we don't get 200 calls a week about smart growth. We get 200 calls a week about what are you going to do about the traffic on Barker Cypress. We don't get 200 agitated people coming down to City Council saying we need a comprehensive plan, and here's why. I go back to what I said at the top of difference in the agencies. We can do lots of slideshows. I've done slideshows just like David's done slideshows for our Transportation Policy Council. We do visioning workshops. Politicians, they're really smart. They have a gift I don't have. They kind of know what's right, and if they've concluded this isn't really right, they're different. There are not as many who are going to want to really stick their neck out on this sort of thing. I know Dr. Kleinberg's survey says it's right, but they need to hear it. They need to hear it from their own voting constituents. They need to hear it consistently. They don't just need to hear it from the experts. And I think that is sort of the last piece. How does this get to a critical mass where that message loop has really closed with those decision makers? Again, I'll use our Ped Bike districts as an example. We have put out 80% money. We've earmarked, if you will, 80% money to do projects in these plans. Local government has to put 20% in. Even with that, it is hard in the budgeting and capital improvements programming of a local government, especially a big one like Houston. It's hard to make that a priority. Sidewalks in Gulfton. There's lots of problems out there. How are we going to make that a priority? Who's the constituency for that? So I think that's the challenge that David alluded to, is that death valley between the shared vision and starting to build the projects when it's actually writing checks for things is the next step. But hopefully you'll invite me back in 10 years and we'll talk about great projects we've done. Thanks.
to me, the whole thing is about, how is the conversation in Houston changed? And I think it's radically different. But what are your thoughts about this? You know, where we are. Are you optimistic, pessimistic, or about where we're going? Or ask some questions if you like. Or go home. This has never happened before.
What is it that you think the elected officials feel is so much more important that these issues are not a concern for them?
I think that a lot of people are still kind of the belief, I'll go back to something you said, Dan, that the chief concern is that we facilitate the delivery of affordable housing. And anything that might appear to limit that in terms of restricting that outward. I mean, the whole Greater Houston Partnership, the Opportunity Houston approach is, got to keep costs down. And density and spending extra money on sidewalks and maybe making it harder to develop greenfields is going to increase costs. And who's going to be for higher cost of housing? So I think that the paradigm shift that needs to occur is it's not that you're for higher housing costs, it's we're demanding higher quality of life. And then be willing to articulate what that means. And I think that's another problem sometimes. We talk about quality of life, everybody agrees with that. What does that mean? Let's come up with some parameters for, 6 parks in Midtown instead of 1. Or maybe a 4-foot sidewalk isn't quite wide enough for our Main Street Champs-Elysees.
There's a factor that's missing in that we tend to look at things myopically rather than holistically. And the focus on affordable housing misses the point that we have unaffordable transportation costs. And that we've got to put, at least those two have to be put together if you look at cost of living. And if you've got affordable housing and unaffordable transportation and you put them together, you've got a higher cost of living than you have in some other place where you've got maybe higher cost of housing but a very, very low cost of transportation. So, and we haven't been looking at that. And part of that is the focus of the development community that from the Allen brothers on has governed politics in Houston, has been focused on that mountain range that's out there that's not really out there. That you just keep getting further and further out, and we got very inexpensive housing. Well, now people are finding out that my secretary, my bookkeeper this morning said, I can't stand it anymore. She lives in Cypress Fairbanks, and she's got to get into inner city Houston, right down here on Kirby and Richmond, to get to the office. And she says, what does it cost to live in Midtown? I've got to move in because the transportation is killing me. Okay, we've seen this coming, but just because we see it coming doesn't mean that we're doing anything about it right now. That kind of stuff tends to stay about 10 years behind the realization of things. So
in fact, all these little pieces of nudging component will eventually push these people to different directions. So it requires these subtle nudging from all directions to change the whole tide. And I remember in Midtown, one of the workshops for the River Corridor, I met this young couple who were having their first child. They live in one of those nice townhomes, and they're talking about the future of their family and how they like living in Midtown and being close to the employment center and the schools. And they were sort of, they said, well, I guess the future is the private school. And I said, well, don't you see how the demographic is changing, and you as a voter, and of course the resident, could change the whole dynamics of the school system inside or the neighborhood, and where your option is not just sending them to AOS and St. John's and all the fancy, expensive private school, but a public school could be improved, and you could be the catalyst for all of that. And he thought about for a few minutes, and I think you're right, things will change.
I just step on your response. I have to respond to this schools issue in 2 ways, though, because I think that is right on. At the ULI meeting where Judge Emmett was on the panel, he said his response basically was, until you do something about schools, you're not going to see massive movement back into the city. This is on a website called rclco.com. Robert Charles Lesser did a presentation at ULI last August. If you look at the demographic chart, the age cohort that is 25 to 35 getting into the family formation, that's the baby bust. Compared to percentage of the overall population, the number of people with kids getting ready to enter school is the smallest share it's been in 50 or 60 years. Developers look at stuff like that. I would speculate that we probably have, and I've heard him say this too, we probably have a vast oversupply of housing already in suburban school districts. Where I think the latent demand, or the undersupply is for people like my daughter, who's 21, who I don't think is looking for school districts yet. She's looking for an exciting place in the city to live. And then me, who's now an empty nester, same deal. I think the other thing is, I believe in our region, the average tenure in a house is 7 years. So, it may take longer than that to fix the schools. You're not going to live in that place forever. Move out to Cypress Fairbanks while your kid's in school, if that's important. You don't want to change from within. But you still have, 50, 60 years to live somewhere else. And we need options for people who want to live closer to work while we're still working on the school. So I'm not saying that's not important, but there's a lot of people in other stages of life who would benefit by more transit efficient locations.
Ken? Did you have
Well, I was just going to comment on Jeff's, what he was saying about the voter apathy, that topic. I think that's really is right on. I think the Gulf Coast Institute, and everybody have an insider's view, has done a great job over the past 10 years of energizing what I would call the planning community and the people that are involved around that. But the next thing we need to do, I think, is get beyond that, stop preaching to the choir, and preach, who's in the audience. We haven't done that well enough yet. I say the average person out there who's not involved in these kinds of meetings probably doesn't even know the Gulf Coast Institute exists. And how we get there is a question that we ought to start thinking about.
It's all connected and it's all important. I heard Judge Emmett say that families move to Kingwood for the school district. And you're talking about a baby bust. I'm seeing a baby boom in my inner city neighborhood. I'm seeing more parents with kids in strollers than I've ever seen in the 30 years that I've lived there. I'm seeing people choose what's left of the urban village lifestyle. But the urban village lifestyle is getting developed out. So the developers don't have a long-term vision. They have a 2-year vision. And we have to get things changed. And I don't know, because the code that sit in Midtown doesn't fit in every part of urban Houston, whether it be inside the loop or outside the loop. We're making unsustainable neighborhoods in our move to density. I'm seeing my neighborhood go to 26 houses per acre, and all of the infrastructure out in the street in the narrow margins of what's left. So we're running the nature out of the neighborhood. We're putting the infrastructure above ground. We're overbuilding, and they don't have the sewer capacity rules that you used to have that caused that moment in time in the 80s. But, so there's a lot of things that have to be fixed, and I think keeping the schools in the neighborhoods is tremendously important. You cannot let that, we have to hold our districts accountable for quality neighborhood schools, and it does take people who have retired and moved inside the loop or still working and living in urban areas to get involved with schools, because those are where the future comes from. So, you know, it's not just your children, it's everyone else's children that are here too, building these affordable houses that are going up, you know, by droves. But my question comes to, what do we do about taxes and land use? Because what I'm seeing is tax base is driving out the mixed village. You're not, if you can't afford to have the grocery store in the neighborhood anymore, the barber shop, the local businesses, you don't get this rich mix that we used to have in Houston in unzoned areas and undeed restricted areas is going away, and it's being driven out by tax base because of the rise in the property taxes mean that little establishments can't stay there anymore. So does anybody have a comment on that, or does it just seem like that should just all, you know, not be really an issue? Tax-based land use don't have a...
Well, I go back to Dan's earlier comment. In San Francisco, they have, you know, got affordable housing offsets and first floor retail requirements on major commercial buildings. So they've fobbed that off on the biggest of developers. And what you'll see there, I think, is interesting is mom and pops, you know, on the first floor of the Bank of America building. Something you just never see here. It's because there's a glut of retail. All these buildings are required to provide it. They got to lease it to somebody. They view it as a loss leader. Now, why is that? Because there's only one downtown San Francisco, and if you want to be there, you've got to play by that rule. Problem here is, if we create a zone like that, we'd probably shut down, you know, development inside the loop. If Interloop had a first floor retail zone, we'd see a lot of stuff built around the loop. In an open system, those types of policies are difficult. I read a radical book that I gave David to read a few years ago, and kind of corrupted my thinking, called Cities in Full. We actually had the author down for our Density by Design conference, and he is rather dubious of, you know, any sort of tax incentive policies that'll work. He's totally supply side. Way to get more mom and pops in business is to have more floor space. I see a lot of underutilized retail centers, even inside the loop in affluent areas. I'm a little hard pressed to believe you can't get affordable space somewhere inside the loop. It may not be in a walkable zone, but I'm not quite sure that's the problem. I think really bringing enough people in, even though that does raise property values, helps. New York City, space is expensive, but I see lots of small businesses in places like Queens and Brooklyn that seem like they're doing just fine because there's 10,000 people live within walking distance of their door. So again, I may sound like a supply sider, but I think we get more dwelling units in the city, and we'll fill up that empty space first, and new space will get developed.
When CBS wanted to come in and build a store at the corner of Main and Elgin, which they eventually did, we did a quick little study for them that showed that with the same building footprint, they could add a second floor. They would have space for 12 apartments on that second floor. They had plenty of space for parking. The rent from the apartments would completely pay for the building, and the store itself could be basically rent-free. And that was just adding one story of living units. So I think if we go a step beyond the kind of neighborhood that was built back in the 20s, where everything was one or two stories, and you go to a community where things are 3, 4, 5, 6 stories, then your ground floor retail becomes very, very inexpensive because what's above it is actually paying the bills.
Well,
Could I
thanks.
go-
Go ahead.
I was going to go back to one other thing that wasn't your question, but I think it's a really important point. You're getting the density without the design. The name of our conference was Density with Design, and I think you're exactly right. It's a weird inversion compared to other places where the problem is we can't get any inner city redevelopment going. I tell people we've got all we can handle here. We can't seem to get things like bar ditches and driveways and local drainage. Where do you put the trash cans right? And I think we were both involved in some of those meetings. That's just going to be a very long haul process because you're right. How you deal with those kind of standards in Rice Military is very different than how you deal with them in Midtown or this thing.
Well, Jeff, thanks very much for coming to this, and I hope all of you will, and to all of you for coming, and I hope you come to the party tonight. And if you haven't ever been to the Crystal Ballroom, it's a pretty cool place. Come on down.
Thanks. See you.
Came back.
See you there? Hey.
Can I bring some gold cards? I think
Yeah.
kind of help me.
Okay, I guess we'll have two tables at the front, so we'll put on the front table. Okay.
See you there.
See you there.
How you doing?
Lawrence is going to babysit.
Oh yeah, good work.
Drew the short straw.